Welcome, everyone, to the Montessori Family Life Series. We're so glad you're with us today. If you have been with us before, welcome back. We're glad you're here this week. If you're new, I'd like to tell you just a couple of things. I also would like to welcome you. We're glad that you're here for the first time. Introduce. There it goes. I'd like to introduce our people that are with us today. We have Jonathan Wolf, who is one of our Montessori family support team. And he is most of the time from the West Coast, but luckily we have him on the East Coast right now in Florida with us. And he is an author, a speaker, Montessori educator, conference presenter, all kinds of stuff. And so we're really glad to have Jonathan here with us today. Thanks, John. And then I'll introduce Tim Selden. Many of you probably already know him and watch him faithfully on Wednesdays. Anyways, Tim Selden is the founder and president of the Montessori Foundation. And he is also an author, speaker, presenter, adult educator, all of those things. And his work is mainly with the Montessori Foundation, doing lots of consulting with schools around the world. So we're glad you're here today, Tim. And last but not least, in fact, most, is Dr. Val Wise. She is from, I want to say, Maryland. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. That's right,
yay.
Bethesda. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Good job. Go, Lord.
The last person I introduced from Maryland, I decided that she was from Massachusetts. So I introduced her as being from Massachusetts.
The M word.
Well, that's what I said. Well, they both start with So anyway, Val is from Maryland. She is a professor at Johns Hopkins University.
Mm-hmm.
She is also a speaker, a presenter. I'm not sure, are you an author also?
Mm-hmm.
Author.
Well. Mm-hmm.
And has done many things over her long career in education, not just Montessori, but in higher education, as well as, I think, private school yes, private school, well. Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay, so Val, we are so glad that you are here today with us to help us with this topic. It's called Parenting Toward Anti-Racism. And you are going to kind of be our leader, and we'll plunge in whenever we can.
Thanks so much, Lauren. And thank you so much for a lovely introduction. And I feel like I come home because John and Tim and you as well are such good friends of mine that being able to talk with all of you together about a topic that's near and dear to my heart just makes me happy. So talking about early childhood and childhood in general, because it's what I've been trained to do. In fact, many of you don't know, but I was trained by Tim Selden in my Montessori education. I'm a Montessori educator as well as a Montessorian since the early 90s. It is what I believe is one of the best educations for young children possible. But let's kind of talk about this idea of raising children to be anti-racist. I think the place that we need to start is to think about this myth of racial innocence. Many times when we talk to parents and even teachers, what we hear is that they don't want to burden children with this rather adult idea of racism. And in fact, that children are born kind of innocent to race and that they don't need this information. So they would rather raise them to be what we call colorblind. Mm-hmm. And I would submit that, and I'm not just me, but many researchers as well as authors would submit that actually the worst conversation to have with a child is no conversation at all about race. Mm. And I wish I were the one to have quoted that, but I'm not. Jamar Tishib as the one who said it, but I think he was quite eloquent in that statement. Because what we know is that the reality is that young children as early as 6 months old understand bias and difference. When I say understand, that they have a propensity toward bias. And the individual who really has done a great deal of research about this is a woman whose name is Dr. Karen Wynn. And Dr. Wynn is the director of the Infant Cognition Center at Yale University and has done some incredible work with children as early as 3 months old. Now, her interest really was in morality and looking at where does morality start? Because remember, people like Rousseau and others believed that there was a tabula rasa, that babies were born with no sense of morality. They were kind of a blank slate. What we now know is that actually the opposite is true. Let me explain what I mean. Dr. Nguyen, with her husband, Dr. Bloomington, they both are at Yale University, started working with very young children. And what they found was that they could see bias as early as 3 months old. What they did was they took puppets, and you might have heard this research before, but I think it's fascinating. They took puppets and they would show the baby the puppets. One puppet maybe would do something really, really kind, and the other puppet would do something that was not so kind. And then, as a puppet show, and then the researcher would show the children the puppets and ask them, which one do you want? Now, what we know is that babies as early as 6 to 8 weeks old will look at the preferred object for longer periods of time. So even if they can't reach out, they can look at it. And if they look at it for more than a few seconds, we know that's what they want. This has been proven over and over again. But what we're finding is that children as early as 3 to 6 months old will go toward the puppet that has done the good thing. Now that makes sense, right? So they have a propensity towards someone who's doing something morally good. But here's where the interesting part happens. What she did then was to pair the puppets with something that the child likes. For instance, giving the puppets two different snacks. Maybe one was green beans and the other was graham crackers.
Now, graham crackers.
Right, exactly. So the baby typically would go for the graham crackers, right? Well, if one of the puppets chose graham crackers over green beans, the child would instinctively go for the puppet that enjoyed the graham crackers because they were similar. And what was interesting was that they would not choose the puppet with the green beans, but they would also enjoy it and prefer a puppet that would punish the puppet who went for green beans. Ooh. Now, the implication for that is that in the child's mind, and what we're thinking now is that there's this original bias happens as early, this very early. We're almost born with this kind of bias that was maybe there to protect us, because biases can be helpful for us. You have a bias towards something that looks scary for you or that looks different. But what we know is that children see bias as this early, and they also other. And their othering then means that they don't want it, they don't want to be near it, and they're not going to choose it as a preferred toy or preferred person. So if this is happening as early as 6 months old, let's kind of scan forward. What happens in a family if the parent says, well, I don't want to talk about race because my child is too young, or I want them to remain innocent from all of this? Then the child who's being raised in a color blind mindset is less likely, and there's research to bear this out, is less likely to point out or understand when discrimination happens. Oh. And this can happen very subtly. Let's say you're at a playground and you're walking along with your child and you're holding your hand. And this has happened to me many times. I know it probably happened in your framework as you're working with schools. And the child will point to someone and say, oh, and talking about the child's brown skin, that child looks dirty. Why is that child dirty? Does it come off? And some parents would cringe and go, oh my God, they're talking about race. We don't say that. That's not nice. And turn and walk away. So what is the child then interpreted in their mind as early as 1 month, 1-year-olds, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds? It's not that mom and dad are trying to say that this is a topic that they're uncomfortable with. What they're hearing is, that's not a good person. This is not a good topic. I should not talk about this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I'm sorry, your thoughts, Lorna?
Oh, I'm just totally understanding and sort of agreeing that, this is real true. It is quite amazing how young children pick up on so many things. And that whole idea of having certain almost inbred biases when we're born is such an incredible thought for me, and as you said, some biases protect us, and so that's probably why we're born with those kinds of reactions, I guess, is for protection. But what it's boiled into is, you know, prejudice and racism and all kinds of other bad things. You know.
Absolutely. If left unchecked, that's
Yeah.
exactly. It's interesting because one of the researchers says that babies are born little bigots, you know, and that's how they're born. And it's interesting because I was a psych major in undergrad school, and my first master's was in psychology. And I remember thinking about people like oh, I can't think of his name right now, but many of the psychologists of the day would say that all of these behaviors are learned. Every Skinner, thank you, B.F. Skinner. At Skinner, if you're a Skinnerian, all of these behaviors are learned. But what we're finding is the research is showing, because we've gotten so sophisticated with this kind of research, is that that's not the case actually. That these aren't just learned behaviors, these are inbred behaviors, these are instinctual behaviors, these are behaviors that were for our protection at one point. But when left unchecked, without an adult, just like in a Montessori classroom, you know, we could have all those materials in the classroom without the guide or the teacher who's the dynamic link between that material, the child can't really unlock the gifts of that. And I know Jonathan always talks about this so often, don't you, Jonathan? John, you're on mute.
Mute.
By the way, Lorna, we've got your screen, your laptop screen share again. You might want to, you know, we're not saying
but it's
glory.
That guy, he just wants to be on the air today, I guess. Sorry. There, is that better?
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, what Val's referring to again is that inner work of the adult. You know, one of my favorite phrases, which Val knows I always like to quote, is the teacher, or in this case, the parent, must purify her heart and render it burning with charity toward the child. When we allow our little biases to seep out, children, especially the youngest children, they absorb that right away. They pick it right up and they just run with it because they're mirroring our mirror neurons. And so it's very important that we really check ourselves to see what are children sensing in our attitudes, in our language, in our thinking, because they are taking it in.
So what we're talking about.
I'm sorry, Val. I just want to echo that many parents think that young children really don't know. They're not young enough to be aware. And there's an old saying, little pitchers have big ears.
Right.
Little children are sensitive to the slightest nuance of emotion, so that if they see you become scared or nervous or angry or disgusted or whatever, they absolutely are aware. They are always watching. They almost have antennae to pick it up. And they may not remember at a conscious level, but it's absolutely stored in the hard drive.
Absolutely, absolutely. So that's the first place I wanted to start, is that this myth of racial innocence, that if we could dispel that, we can go a long way toward really helping to raise anti-racist children. And the thing is, there was some research in 2017 that said that 50% of white parents do not discuss race with their children, or have not discussed race with their children. And
how many of us? There are three white people right here on the screen. How many of us ever had our parents talk about racism?
Right.
I did.
Oh, you're unique. You're unique. But he kind of he bears out my statistic about 50%. Right?
Yeah.
So, because in our little group right here, I'm not white, but my family did talk about it very early on for a variety of reasons. And I did talk with my own children, because I've raised two boys, in fact, who are wonderful young men now. But it was our conversation constantly. But here's the thing: if you don't have someone who has modeled it for you, then A, you don't realize that it's important, and B, you're uncomfortable with getting into that conversation. But what I'm hoping we've established is that first, there is no racial innocence, that there is a color-blind way to raise children that could be detrimental for them. But then there's this color-brave way. And I'm not the one, I wish I were the one to coin that phrase, because it is brilliant. A woman whose name is Melanie Hart, she coined the phrase, but it's brilliant to be color-brave. And that's the individual who understands what it means, is not afraid to talk about race or racism, is comfortable with the conversation and knows when to bring it up and recognizes how to talk about it with their children. So here's the other part of this. Lorna, when you and I were talking about this, we talked about what the stages of racial identity development in students, in our children. And what we've now established, I'm hoping, from research from Yale University and so many others, is that 3 months old isn't too early to think that they're already getting this established idea. And what from John and Tim said, that they're also getting from not just their parents, but the atmosphere, you know, the junk culture that we have from television, from our cell phones, from our conversations with each other, from just everywhere. You know, I used to think that I could protect my kids from all of that information. And I'll never forget, Power Rangers were a big thing when I was raising my boys. And I didn't want them to be, you know, I didn't want them to be violent. And they never watched the show. They never watched it, never watched the television programs like that, never watched violent television programs. One day we're walking down the street and there's a bookstore that has Power Ranger people in costume out front, and you could take a picture with them. My 2-year-old boy, my youngest right now, my 2-year-old ran up and struck the pose. I swear to you, he never seen them before, but they all looked at him and they did the same pose because they all knew that pose. Where Jordan got it from, I have no idea. But the reality is that it's that the air around our children seeps in no matter what we do. So we have to arm them to be ready to either dispel it, understand it, explain it to others, or fight against it. Now, we talked about these stages of children's racial identity development. By age 2, we talk about 3 months old to about age 2, they're beginning to get these social stereotypes and the biases about people being different and what that means. And if it's discomfort or fear, there's a really good illustration I heard from someone recently where a child was in the back of the car and they're driving along and she says to her mom, "Mommy, Black people are garbage men." And she's a white mom, white child, and she gets, "Oh my God." And then she thinks, wait a minute, calm down, ask her what she means, right? What does she mean? And she says, "Every Black person I've seen on a truck has been Black." And then she takes a moment and says, "You know what? I understand how you feel that way, but let's go meet some other people. Remember your principal at school? That person's Black. Remember so not everyone is." So instead of getting, "Oh my God, don't say that," she began to explain it to her child. And that's the way that we can help children, and understanding that they're becoming aware of this and now putting words to it. And we have to give them the category to put it into. I was in a store one day. I'm sorry, go ahead, Lorna.
That's okay. I think that awareness is such a big key. We in Montessori classrooms, and I forget if you and I talked about this when we were talking earlier, but in Montessori classrooms, when children are learning about the sounds of the alphabet, and they write the word, let's say cat, with the movable alphabet on the rug, but they write it with a K. We don't come along and correct the K. But when the child looks up at us and says, does it start with a C or a K? Then we know they're ready for that information because they're aware that there's some kind of a rule about C's and K's, you know, and they want to know what the thing is. And I think that's really true with little children too. We need to recognize when they want information and give it to them in doses that they can handle and in ways they can handle it.
Absolutely. And
just one quick thought that I think is worth adding in. It's probably self-evident, but what Val's talking about has to do with race, but these kinds of biases can have to do with perceptions about people that are fat, people that are wealthy, people that are male, female, Jewish, you name it. It's all interconnected. It's just race is a color of skin in the case of people of certain ethnic origins where you wear it all the time, whereas someone who's wealthy could dress differently, you wouldn't know. But biases are learned, as Val says, at such an early age.
And what's interesting is that I loved your illustration too, Lorna, about the movable alphabet, because the reason that they could make those errors is because we've exposed them to the sounds.
Right.
You know, they've seen in the movable alphabet all these, so they can pick the ones that work for them. And that's the same thing here, that we have to think about exposure. So
Yes.
another really important part of this is that if you are in a very limited social structure where your child doesn't get to see much else, besides, it just happened, you may happen to live in an area where there's not much diversity, then you're going to really have to depend on helping them to get that diversity by television shows and movies and reading stories and telling stories and using color as part of the story, or using whatever that diverse piece of it is that you need to bring into it. And so that's by age 2. By age 4, and we see this especially in early childhood classrooms, in our primary classrooms, they're beginning to label. And they're beginning to make their own theories about disabilities, about skin tone, about gender, they're trying to judge adult verbal and nonverbal responses. So because of that, they're going to make errors. And in Montessori, we don't always correct the error, you know, because we want them to learn from that error. And so we have to be really careful about how we jump in and out of this to make sure that when we're correcting or supporting them through learning about this, that we're not shutting down the conversation as well.
Val, would you say it's correct that the tendency among perhaps white parents and white teachers, when they see a child say something that, you know, appears to be racist, like, oh, your skin is, oh, look, you have a chocolate skin, that either people go into denial and don't address it at all, or they overreact and go judgmental? In other words, they're really not helping the child process, well, let's take a close look at this and let's talk about where people of different skin colors come from, and let's listen to their story. They either is no response because there's so much white fragility or white denial, or it's like, we don't say that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is where the power of being color brave comes in. And also what Montessori talked about is observation. And I know Tim taught me the most incredible, my observation course and my philosophy course in Montessori was taught by Tim. And he gave me such great examples of how to be a really good observer of young children's behavior. And this is how important that is, because if you ask the right question, then you will understand where the child is coming from. Another example. So I heard a young woman a white woman who was talking about her daughter again in the car. And she says, just out of the blue, I love white people. And her mom looks back at her and says, okay, give me a second. I love white people. What does that mean? What does that mean? And so she says, well, what do you mean? And she says, like the white person on the sign, the walk sign.
Oh.
Yes, the walk sign is a white person. So she wasn't judging by race. She was judging by what she saw on the sign. Now, could the mom use that as a great example to talk about race? Of course she could. But it shows you how observation and asking those really questions and becoming curious. That's the other thing that we learn as Montessori educators, is becoming curious about what the child is trying to tell us when they're working in the classroom. So we become curious about the conversation, about where our child is with that.
Well, what's interesting, what I'm hearing, Val, is that if the adult models curiosity, like, tell me more about, you know, why you saw that, or what you're thinking, or what you saw on the sign, doesn't that begin to help the child become a curious person about people of color? Like, tell me your story.
Absolutely. Tell me your story. And I'll give you another example. I was in a grocery store one day, and a little boy pointed at me and said, "Mommy, she's brown." And the mom, bless her heart, looked at her son and said, "Yes, and isn't she beautiful?" And I was like, you know, right? And that was so powerful. I kind of wish I had said something like that, because it was brilliant the way she said it. It wasn't oh, let me think about it. It just came off, and you could tell that she had already done that work within herself, that she accepted that this is all beautiful. And she just said, "Yeah, isn't she beautiful?" And I was thinking, yeah, I'm beautiful. But yes. Now, so we've talked about ages 2 and 4. At 5, they're going to start comparing race and becoming a bit more exclusionary. They may exclude on the, this is the time on the playground, you might see the girls playing together and saying the boys can't play. The boys playing
Yeah.
together and saying the girls can't play. You can't be a princess because you're brown, and none of the princesses in Disney are brown, or whatever that thing is. You can't be the queen today because you're a boy. All of those pieces. And in classrooms, I typically like to tell teachers, you cannot sit by and not say anything when you hear those things. And as John said, I think so eloquently before, you have to ask the question. You've got to become curious and get in there with their play. And you'll hear these conversations, and it's incumbent upon us, especially after we have the research from Dr. Wynn from Yale, who said that there is bias there, and we're the ones who have to kind of stack all the pieces to help them mitigate that bias or use bias in a way that's appropriate. It's interesting that as we get to 5 and then age 6, they are becoming much more attuned to their own groups. They understand what it means to be an in-group and an out-group. They understand language a lot more as well. So they will be able to switch between the language of their culture and the language of the community that they're living in. And at about age 6 as well, for children who are not native, or whose families are not native to the United States, you might hear them begin to put away their language of their home because they become embarrassed and they want to become part of who the culture, the dominant culture is. And I always talk to parents about this as well as teachers to say, do everything possible to make sure that they're comfortable with their home language. Because what we want is a multilingual world. We don't want them to lose that, but they typically begin to lose it at age 6.
Yeah. You know, Val, I had a family join Newgate School a long time ago when I was associate head. And they were in the admissions process, and they were from Japan. That the family was, and they had 2 boys, and they came to our school. Tim, you remember them, I bet. They came to our school, and they were looking around at the school, and we were touring, and the mom, or no, it was the dad. The dad said to me, I have to ask you a question. I said, okay, what is it? He said, well, in the school that my little boy is in right now, they've told us that we need to stop speaking Japanese at home. We need to stop speaking to our child in our language because he'll never learn English properly. Will you make us stop speaking Japanese at home?
Oh,
and I said, no, absolutely not. Please do. Teach us,
That's so ridiculous.
And that really does happen to children, and it's not just their language, their culture, which is so wonderful and beautiful and vibrant. They need to know that.
And we could go a whole 45 minutes on I could go all day literally on culture alone, talking about the importance of maintaining culture. We'll have to talk about that at some point, because that's the heart and soul of a family, and to make them hang it at the door is saying in effect that it doesn't matter, that it's not important, and that the dominant culture is much more important. So being careful about that as well. Good, excellent. By the age of 9 to 10, the research right now is saying that racist discriminatory attitudes can become solidified, and it's very difficult to change a child's innate feeling. I mean, it would take something cataclysmic, something massive. Maybe they're dropped into a whole culture where they have to be there, and that something that massive would have to change their attitude about that. But it's also interesting that acculturation and ideas of anti-racism and anti-bias can change that. And I'll give you an example. Again, at Yale University, a great research study. They had children who were between the ages of 5, I think it was, maybe it was 5 to about 12. And what they noticed, what they were doing was they were giving children tokens, and your tokens could buy you something. So the more tokens you had, the more things you could buy. The thing was, they had 2 grids. One grid was green and the other was blue. And each grid was cut in half. So you would have 5 tokens on the green bottom, 5 tokens on the black bottom, 0 tokens on the top, maybe, and 5 tokens on the other. The child could decide how many tokens they got by choosing one or the other, right? Here's the thing. Depending on which one they chose, the researcher would say, if you choose this one, a child in another room who they'd never seen would also get that, right? So you'll get 5 tokens. If you choose the green, the other child will get 5 tokens. But if you choose the black, you'll get 5 tokens, but the other child will get no tokens. From age 5 to about 9, all of the children would choose the green. They would rather the child in the other room not have any tokens, even if it meant they didn't get as many tokens. So let's say the black tokens where you could share with the other person had 7 for you. If you only gave the other one 5, they would still rather have maybe 3 tokens and get the other one none. It wasn't until the acculturation happened in about 9 years old that they began to see that the children would say, oh, no. In fact, I want you to give all the tokens to the other child in the other room. What the researchers have kind of concluded was that by 9, our culture and the families have really put into them this idea of generosity and compassion and empathy. It was not there before. So children don't come pre-wired with this idea of compassion and empathy. It has to be taught to them. They are not these angelic creatures who want to give to everyone. We have to teach it. And I think that was a really good example. That research was a really good example of this, how important it is for us to have a thoughtful process about helping children become anti-racist and anti-bias.
For sure. Val, I want to just let you know that we have about 10 minutes left. I also want to let all of our folks who are with us today know that we welcome you to ask questions. So this is a perfect time. If you have something on your mind, please write it into the questions area of the screen and I will let them know. Okay.
Well, maybe in my last couple of minutes, let me just kind of talk about a couple of things. One is maybe 3 things. That one of the things you need to do is pay attention to your child. Pay attention to who they're playing with, how they're playing, their conversation, as John said and as Tim said, be curious about it. Be curious about what they're doing. The other is separate your stuff from their stuff. And this is what I mean. I give you an example again of the young woman who the child said, oh, I like white people. Her stuff was, I'm living in a racialized world. She's talking about race. When her stuff was, I really like the little white man who's walking across and makes me cross the street every day. So try to separate those 2 things from each other. And the other is understand the context. Understand the context of race in the United States. So that really means doing your homework. And that is probably the most difficult piece of it because the United States history is painful. And we've, as a nation, have worked really hard to suppress that memory. And because of that, we tend to make the same mistakes. John said it, I think very well in the very beginning of this when he quoted Dr. Montessori and kind of making sure that we change ourselves. So if I had anything to say about this, I think the most important piece of all of this is that we need to start with ourselves. So yes, all of these pieces, how to talk with children, what books to read, and there's so many right now, some incredibly wonderful books that we can use to help with becoming literate in terms of race for our children. But it's our own internal processes that we need to kind of root out. And it's not a one-time deal. You don't just take an anti-racist course and become anti-racist. You don't take an anti-bias course and become anti-bias. We are all biased. I'm biased. We're all biased. So it's a constant kind of weeding that we have to do to kind of continue to get that out. And then become color brave. Be the person to speak out about it. Be the person to bring the conversation up and ask, is this a problem? Should we be doing more? Should we be thinking about this? Ask the question at your school, at your place of work. Be that ally. And we're using the term ally a lot now because being an ally is a powerful place to be. And it is also demonstrating to your child that what it means. And they always know. They know when you're doing that thing.
I'm really taken with this phrase, color brave. I'm really enjoying this wonderful book, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Kendi. And he makes the point, the issue is not racist, not racist. The opposite of racist is anti-racist, that we are helping children and helping ourselves do things that are discovering racism, embedded racism, and counteracting it. It's got to be proactive. It's got to be brave. It's not just a matter of saying to my child, well, I'm not a racist and therefore you won't be a racist. It's not about not racist. It's like, what are you going to do to advocate against racism within yourself, within communities, within institutions. It's got to be proactive.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's a great book that just came out. It's called Don't Look Away. And it's talking about those same conversations but with young children. And I found it to be really eloquent in how the authors have talked about those kinds of conversations. So I totally agree with you on that. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think it's interesting when we deal with our own children as parents. You know, I can remember when I was growing up, and I'm kind of old now, but so it was quite a while ago. It wasn't a recent occurrence, but I grew up in Massachusetts, and I grew up in a small blue-collar town, and there was not one family of color, black, brown, Japanese, I mean, nobody, Indian. It's just they all looked like me. And so, you know, in some ways, I guess we just didn't talk about it because it didn't exist for us. You know, it was like it just didn't exist. And I remember that my church actually was the first place that I ever started thinking about anti-racism and so forth. And I was a teenager at that time, and it was the 60s. So that's telling you how old I was. And our church was very actively involved in working with other African American churches in different parts of Massachusetts and this sort of thing. And you know what? That year, a family of color bought a house across the street from us. And my father said a thing that I just almost fell on the floor about. And he said, well, that's gonna affect the value of our property.
There goes the neighborhood.
And I was in shock because I thought, Dad, how can you say that? You know, I don't understand. I never thought about you you know, I didn't say this to him, of course, but I'm thinking in my brain, I never thought of you as a person who is biased about color because it never came up. But I bet you in some ways, it did come up. I just wasn't conscious about it. And they weren't conscious about it either. You know?
Absolutely.
So, you know, it's just a thing. If you have children in a Montessori school, those of you that are listening today, the good news about Montessori school, and it's not perfect, by the way, nor are the teachers or any of us that work in Montessori, but at least we have this idea of global awareness and of that it's a big world and there's lots of beliefs and lots of cultures and lots of things like that. And so when you go into a Montessori classroom and you look in their book corner, you probably will see many diverse books about many different cultures. If you don't, that's a way for you to be an advocate for anti-racism. That's a way for you to buy a book and donate it to the school or talk to the teacher about it. If your culture, if you go into your child's classroom and there aren't books and things in the geography area about your culture, you can be an advocate. You can share your culture with the people at your school. So there are things that you can do as a parent to even enrich what may already be happening in the Montessori classroom, or maybe it isn't and needs to be. So you can help with that.
Absolutely. I think about all the incredible map work that goes on in Montessori classrooms that lends itself to the exploration of others and how beautifully it's done in so many schools across the world. Montessori classrooms, because Montessori actually started that. She's the one who thought about making sure that the young child had the earth in her hands, as opposed to waiting until they were much older. So there is a platform for all of this to happen. within a Montessori classroom that's quite beautiful.
Yeah, yeah.
I think one of the things that I think to Lorna's point, many private Montessori schools tend to have independent schools rather homogeneous populations. They may not be very diverse. That's part of the demographics of a lot of Montessori schools. And the question I love to ask parents is, do you think your child is going to end up when they're an adult only going out into communities and into businesses and organizations working with just 40-year-old white men? It's like, the fact of the matter is all these children in many private independent schools who may be only surrounded by other white students and white teachers, that is not the world they're going to go into. They're going to be working in a very diverse environment. The question is, will they be able to handle that with an open mind and an open heart and a real voice of advocacy, or will they simply be another passive recipient of unconscious racism?
Isn't that interesting? Because what we know is that by 2045, it will be majority minority in the United States. We're already majority minority in kindergarten. So it's going to be a wonderful panoply of a variety of cultures, and it's going to be amazing. So we all need to be prepared to enjoy that.
Absolutely. We have somebody who actually has a question, and we're so excited. Lillian, thank you for typing this in. She says, and I'm going to go first because I'm the one that can see the question, but then each of you can add to it. If there is one or two books to recommend to our parents to read, what would they be as a starting point? And so my recommendation would be a book called Amazing Grace. And it's about a girl of color. I think she's from Jamaica. She's from the islands someplace, southern. And she wants to be Peter Pan in the school play. And the kids in her school are telling her, no, you can't be Peter Pan. You're not a boy. And then, no, you can't be Peter Pan. You're not, I forget what they told her, but it had to do with her skin color. I don't think they said she was white, but somehow that got into it. And she has this wonderful grandmother who helps her to learn to have a good feeling about her identity and that she can be anything she wants to be. It's a really wonderful book. It's not a new book, but it's called Amazing Grace. And
it's a classic.
That would be my recommendation.
Now, I don't know whether she's asking about a book for her child or a book for her. Since you've given a book for the child, I'm going to do a book for her.
Right. Okay,
So
give her a book for her.
For her. Now, I'm not sure whether she is a person of color or a white person, but I'm going to do two books. One is called Raising White Kids, and it's by Jennifer Harvey, which is a fantastic book. That one's for her. And then the other one I talked about earlier was that I think is a pretty amazing, is called Don't Look Away, brand new. I'm trying to find the author because I couldn't think of the author off the top of my head. Of course I can't find it, but it's called Don't Look Away, Embracing Anti-Bias Classrooms, which is also great for parents though. I want them to recognize that. And then one last one that I think is pretty powerful. Can We Talk About Race and Other Conversations by Beverly Daniel Tatum, PhD. She's like Kendi's book for everybody right now. She's the one that started this whole conversation. If you want to talk about anything having to do with young children and racism and all that, it's her work. And then the last one, if you read anything by Louise Derman Sparks, she is an early childhood researcher who looks specifically at race in early childhood.
Wow. And that's great that you did that because I totally misread it. And she does want books for adults, for their parents. And she said if there's one or two podcasts for them to listen to. I don't know if anybody knows of any of those.
Yes, actually there's one, and Tim and I keep talking about doing this, and we will one day. But there's a friend of mine who, her name is Jen Court. She's on iHeartRadio. And she is, and the name of her podcast is Third Space. And it's on iHeartRadio, Third Space, and this is all she talks about. She's a white woman, very socially aware. It's pretty powerful stuff that she has lots of great speakers that come on, but she's great. She's a person to listen to.
Terrific. All right, and she has one more question here before you, John. Do you think it would be appropriate for us as a school to give each of our parents an anti-racist book?
Ooh.
John's
One,
nodding
the money
yes.
in this economy, but certainly at the very least encouraging it and creating a book group. One of the things that I experience with parents is, if you just hand them something and they don't buy into it, it basically sits on the shelf and you've put precious money into the buying of this. But suggesting to parents that we have a virtual book club to look at this topic, or finding someone in your community or nationally who might be able to do a private talk with your families to get them talking to each other. And one of the things that Montessori does so beautifully, we have lots to learn as a community, but one of the things we do beautifully is we teach children how to interview people and listen to their stories. And I think it's safe to say that while a lot of the non-public Montessori schools are comparatively lily white or much less diverse than what you might see in a major city like where Val and I are from, Washington, D.C., we tend to raise kids who are really, shall we say, less biased, more oriented, what I would call partnership and celebration and embracing of differences. And I think part of that is the anthropology that's behind Montessori, what we call the great lessons, the idea of getting people to really talk to each other, to resolve conflicts, to get beyond shaming them when they act racist, as any young kids will sooner or later, but getting them to really find a way to grace and courtesy and peacefulness. It tends to be a start. And what I love about Lillian's questions is she's asking, what can we do with our family? What can we do with our school, Stanley? That's the right questions to be asking. Val?
Absolutely.
You and I have work to do.
We have work to do.
Well,
Yes,
I want to just piggyback on that for a minute. It's a wonderful question, how to get this discussion started in your school. Before we give parents resources, how about just a discussion with parents and teachers together? Let's describe with regard how these children, when they grow up to be adults, how they interact in a world of diversity. Let's describe the kind of character and personality we want for our children when they become adults. And let's talk about the society we want and the world we want. In other words, start a vision discussion, like what is the outcome for human beings we want each of our children to be, and what is the outcome for society and our institutions, and get the buy-in. Because I found amazingly, once you get people talking about the kind of human beings and the kind of world they want, there's actually a lot of commonality. So I would start with the top of the mountain and then work down to, so how can we learn about this as a group?
As
Lillian
we get
wants
closer,
to also know, Lillian would also like to know if we have any ideas about who they could invite to their school to do a parent talk to get them going. Lillian is on this thing.
Go on, Lillian.
Where is Lillian located?
I'm trying to find out. I was looking for her.
Well, it doesn't really matter because with Zoom now, we could all be anywhere.
You're
Anyway,
absolutely, Val.
but I will tell you, Lillian, that I love to talk about this topic. It's what I do, and I've been doing this with the foundation for a bit now, and I have my own firm that does it as well, Dr. Valeda Wise Consulting. It is such great work. It is, we've got a lot of work to do, but it's great work, and I encourage all of us to kind of get in there and really get to digging with it.
Thank you. You know what, gang?
We're running over.
We really are running over, and I like to, as much as I'm loving this topic, Val, I'm going to have to ask you, you don't have to answer, to come back at least one more time. And I've just asked Lillian if she would please send me her email address, and this was really a good beginning. There's a lot more that we can talk about and share about, and I would love to do that with my guests and my panelists, as well as all of you that are out there. And so we'll keep this conversation going.
Excellent.
And thank you so much for coming today, all of you that
Thank you for having me.
helping us with this, and all of you that are attending and watching. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. See you next
Thank
week.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye now. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.